Hello, and welcome again to Base Bible Study. In this video, we're going to be talking about a fairly simple question, at least so it sounds. What is the Old Testament story? And what we're really going to try and do in this session is talk about the historical events that are described in the Old Testament from a high level, giving you the start to stop picture of the kinds of things that happened during the Old Testament. And this is very helpful in that it sets a historical context. It provides a way to understand where these events happened in the overall story of human history. And it also gives us a great insight into understanding the kinds of events that the peoples in the Old Testament stories were experiencing. And how can we better understand their stories by understanding the kinds of events that they were experiencing? So let's jump right in. So as a reminder, what we're talking about here with the Old Testament story is a series of events that began around 2000 BCE and stretched for about 1500 years to the year approximately 500 BCE. And during most of this time, the events themselves were not recorded in a written fashion, but by oral tradition. And it wasn't really until the year around 1000 that we begin to see initial writings being compiled. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that in a couple of minutes as we explore some of these major events that happened during the history. But let's start at the beginning. And the beginning really starts again around 2000 BCE with the character of Abram. Now, Abram lived in Ur, which was part of ancient Mesopotamia. Abram was called by God to leave his family and his home and journey into a new land, the land of Canaan, which Abram did, going up to Haran initially and then down into the land of Canaan. In that land of Canaan, he bore a son, Isaac, or his wife did, Sarah, I should more accurately say. And then Jacob was the son of Isaac. And so these three are often called the patriarchs of ancient Israel, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, after a period of time, one of Jacob's sons and the rest of his family, in fact, moved to Egypt because there was a famine in Egypt. And the son Joseph became a high-ranking official in Egyptian government because of his remarkable interpretation of a dream and his administration of the famine in Egypt. Unfortunately, though, for the family of Joseph, a new administration, a new Pharaoh arose. And this is how Exodus begins. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So, with this change of administration, Joseph lost his political authority as well as his family. And fairly soon, the entire Hebrew people were enslaved by the Egyptian government and were so enslaved for about 400 years. Now, following this, now we're at around 1300 BCE, the character of Moses arises in the story. And this is the famous story of the Ten Commandments and the Exodus through the Red Sea. So this is the story of Moses leading the people out of Egypt to the mountain of God, Mount Sinai, where they received the Ten Commandments and other laws from God, and then wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And so it was during this period of time that kind of the random group of people, of slaves that kind of left Egypt in a big collective, transformed into a community of faith that was essentially constructed around this body of law. This was now the practice of that faith. The next step was the movement back into the land of Canaan, from which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had journeyed to Egypt originally. Now, the problem here, of course, was that Canaan already was occupied. There were people living there already. Most of the people in Canaan were farmers. They were living in settled villages at the time. The Hebrews, on the other hand, had just come out of slavery in Egypt. They knew nothing about farming or agriculture or how to do any of that. So rather than this being a conquest, because the Hebrews were not an army, it was more of a gradual assimilation into Canaan and a gradual spreading into the land, in particular areas of Canaan like the hill countries, the elevated parts that were not as suitable to agriculture because the rest of the land was taken. And so in many cases, this is why we see many of the initial settlements in that hill country, throughout the center of the land of Canaan at the time. But they began expanding from those initial footholds until around the year 1000, we do find the emergence of the very powerful figure of David, who unified the so-called 12 tribes of Israel, named for the 12 sons of Jacob, into a united kingdom that stretched from almost the Sinai Peninsula itself all the way up through the land of Canaan into what we would now call modern-day Syria. This united kingdom was the greatest extent of territory that the Hebrew people have ever had of their own, and was governed by David first and then his son Solomon. This is the apex of the Hebrew kingdom. Unfortunately, it didn't last. And I might add here that this was the time, that year 1000, when we begin to see the writings start to be compiled, because now they have an organized government, right? They began writing laws, codifying a lot of these histories together. But after Solomon, the kingdom split into two, a northern kingdom of Israel, a southern kingdom of Judah. Two of the 12 tribes stayed in the south, tribe of Judah and Benjamin. The other 10 formed the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, notably, Jerusalem is in the southern kingdom. So the temple itself, the center of worship and practice, remained in the southern kingdom of Judah. And that does become important, as we'll see. So as time progressed, other powers arose around these two kingdoms, namely Assyria, centered in Nineveh, their capital, rapidly expanded during the 800s, 700s BCE, conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 721. This resulted in essentially the disbursement of the people of the northern kingdom throughout the Assyrian Empire, as was the Assyrian practice, and the repopulation of that area that had been Israel with many peoples from throughout the Assyrian Empire. The land became known as Samaria, and of course, that might ring a bell with some of you, and that this is where we get the term Samaritans in the New Testament, because of these people who were repopulated into what once was the northern kingdom of Israel. Only Judah remained as the true covenant people at the time. But that didn't last either. It was barely another century in the year 587 that another power, Babylon, conquered Assyria. Babylon, now headquartered in Babylon, very close to Ur, where Abram was originally from, you may remember. Babylon conquered the southern kingdom, and they didn't just conquer it, they razed it to the ground. They destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple, palaces, all of the buildings, all of the great monuments that David and Solomon had built. Many of the people in the city were killed, slaughtered, or died of starvation, or were physically removed by the Babylonians into exile throughout the Babylonian Empire. Many of them were taken back to the capital or that area. Many of the rest of them just scattered throughout the empire. This event is called the exile, and unmistakably is probably one of the greatest disasters in the history of the Hebrew people. Everything was gone. Everything had been destroyed at that time. Now, not very long after, that was 587, only about 2 or 3 generations later, guess what? Another power arose, Persia from the east. Persia conquered Babylon. Now that empire stretched from almost India all the way into modern-day Turkey and Egypt. Now Cyrus, who came to power, was a fairly progressive and intelligent leader. he allowed many of the peoples he had conquered to reestablish their original cultures, their original traditional practices of religion. And the Hebrews were one example of this. So Cyrus allowed a community of Hebrew exiles to journey back to the ruins of Jerusalem and rebuild the city and rebuild the temple and reestablish their traditional religions there. He footed the bill for it too. He understood that by doing this, he would gain political capital from many of these conquered peoples and thus spread his influence throughout his empire. So, under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Hebrew people, at least a significant number of them, moved back and reestablished the temple and the city of Jerusalem. In a sense, recapitulating Abram's original journey from almost the same place back into the land of Canaan to reestablish temple worship and practice. Kind of a remarkable ending of a spinning circle. So, completing the full circle here of starting again in Ur, into Canaan, back, and now back we're in Canaan again. So this is the bird's eye view of the whole history. Two major events form the bookends: the Exodus, the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments, the deliverance out of Egyptian slavery that established the faith community. And then on the other end, the exile, where the faith community was destroyed and scattered throughout the ancient world and left in ruins. And then the reestablishment of that in the return. But it is these two big bookend events, the Exodus and the exile, that really form the fundamental context of the story of the Old Testament. Now, it's so important that it's not highly inaccurate at all to say that the Old Testament was written as a response to the exile. It was looking back at all of that calamitous history to understand how it happened and what we can learn from it. And so almost all of the Old Testament, certainly the historical documents of the Old Testament, were written after the exile as a response to the exile. And there are two large source traditions that we can talk about that gave us this history as we now understand it. One of them are called the priestly traditions, or P. And this is a group of editors that were very concerned with temple worship, with ritual worship, and reestablishing that. They are largely responsible for compiling the books that we now know as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. A second tradition is often called D for Deuteronomistic historians. It's a very long name, but it basically means a second history. It starts with Deuteronomy and then stretches through Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And in fact, it's the whole history. So Deuteronomy starts with the beginning of the people, the Exodus, and 2nd Kings ends with the exile. So it's the full story. And it's also interesting to note that, again, Deuteronomy, being a second history, recapitulates most of the material in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. It's a separate tradition, second history. But it doesn't stop with that. It continues on through the whole history, right, to the end of the exile. Now, what emerges from these writings are some very important concepts that really are the basis of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Decalogue being the heart of the law and the kinds of relationships it encourages us, they say, requires us to create as faithful people. The one relationship that we start with is the relationship between an individual person, me, if you will, and God. It is this vertical relationship. And the first 4 commandments talk about it. No other gods besides God, no idols, do not misuse the divine name, and remember the Sabbath. It is those 4 laws that really establish the appropriate relationship between any person and God. The other 6 laws establish relationships that are horizontal between a person and other people. honor your parents, don't murder other people, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. All of these commandments talk about building a healthy relationship with other people. So we have the vertical relationship between a human and God, the first four, and then the horizontal relationship between a person and their neighbors. And of course, this is where we get the great two commandments. They fall out quite naturally. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. This is the famous Shema from Deuteronomy. It establishes the vertical relationship, God first. The second law, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, encapsulates the entirety of the other six commandments. The love of neighbor, love of God, vertical, love of neighbor. It's pretty simple, really. That's all there is to it. Those are the two great commandments that fall out of these Old Testament stories and form the context in which the stories evaluate their own history. In fact, if you look at how the Deuteronomistic historians evaluate the kings, it falls out again quite naturally. There were 19 kings in Israel in the northern kingdom. According to D, the source, they were all terrible. Why? Because they did not worship properly. They did not worship at the temple in Jerusalem. They set up other temples. They created idols. Again, this judgment is not based on their economic policies, how militarily successful they were, how many marvelous buildings they were able to build, how wise they may have been or influential on the world stage. None of that mattered to these historians. One thing did. Did they keep the covenant? Did they create the correct relationships between God and other people? And if they didn't, they failed. Simple as that. The 20 kings of Judah fared only a little better, all right, in the minds of these historians. A couple of them did an okay job, Hezekiah and Josiah, but none of them were as good as David. And David, of course, is the gold star king, the exemplar, the king that was godly, that created this tradition of covenant relationship from the point of view of the kingship of Israel. And so we see that this is the way that all of these kings were evaluated, looking back from exile. Here's just a couple of quick examples that you'll find in some of the actual texts in 1 Kings 15 and 16. So it starts in 15 with Asa. When Asa began to reign over Judah, he reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. We even know the name of his mother, which is unusual. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, as David had done. Now, what does this mean? He put away illicit priests out of the land and removed all of the idols that his ancestors had made. Do you see? It's purity of worship, commitment to God. In contrast, let's read about Ahab, who became the king of Israel around the same time. This is the next chapter. Ahab, son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all of the others before him. Why? What was the evil? Well, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam was the first king of Israel who had set up all of these false temples and idols, so that was a real problem. Even if you make light of that, he took as his wife Jezebel, daughter of Ethbal from Sidonia, a foreigner who worshiped Baals, right? Who worshiped other gods. He erected an altar for Baal. He erected sacred poles, which were means of worship, idols, basically. Ahab did more to provoke the anger of the Lord than any of the other kings before him. So you see there, again, the judgment rod. It is about worship, the covenant. It's not how smart he was, not how economically interesting or powerful he was. Was the purity of following the law correct? And again, it's to answer these questions, looking back from exile, from that period of calamity, what happened? What can we learn? The questions. Why did God let it happen? Why do bad things happen to good people, right? Why did God let this happen to us? Where did God go? Many people thought God was dead. God was supposed to live in the temple. The temple is now rubble. Is God still around at all? What did we do wrong? Where did we go astray? What does God want from us anyway? And is there any hope? Well, why did it happen? We were unfaithful. Not a God problem, it's an us problem, right? We left. We were unfaithful to the covenant. Where did God go? Nowhere. God's still here. We left. We went away, not God. What did we do wrong? We broke the covenant. We broke the law. We did not establish the correct relationships between God and ourselves and between ourselves and other people. What does God want from us? Pretty simple. Just do it. Create the correct relationships. Right relationship with God, right relationship with other people. Is there hope for the future? Well, of course there is, because God, unlike us, keeps God's promises. So the promises of God are everlasting and completely dependable. That is where the future lies. So that's the story of the Old Testament, 30,000-foot view. Hope this has been helpful, and we'll see you next time.